Welcome back. This is Module 2, Lecture 1. This lecture will come in two parts. We are talking today about culture. What is culture? Basically, we can say that when we talk about society, society is based on its culture. Culture is many different things, which we'll break down in just a minute, but the most important thing about culture is that it is passed down from one generation to the next. So culture is cumulative in nature, that it builds on the culture that was handed down. Every generation adapts and changes the culture, but then for the most part hands down the core culture that was handed down to that generation. Probably, again, the closest thing that we sometimes talk about when we talk about laws, when we talk about social sciences, and one of the most important ones is this: culture is not natural. We are not born with culture. Okay? If you remember my example from last module, I talked about the idea of a North American child being taken away and raised in a different culture. And what would we come to find? Well, we would come to find that that child, despite the fact being born with all the biological characteristics of a North American child, would display and exhibit the culture in which it was raised. So in other words, we learn culture, we are not born with it. So we can basically break down culture into two types. We have what we call symbolic, or sometimes also called non-material culture, and then of course the flip side of that would be material culture. The basic difference between these two types, if you're ever trying to figure out whether or not something is symbolic or material culture, the easiest way, and the way I've often used to define the difference between the two, is material culture is anything that has in some way a physical substance. In other words, you can touch it. So if you can touch something, then chances are it falls under the idea of material culture, whereas when we talk about non-material or symbolic culture, we're typically talking about things that have to do with thinking or behavior. Now, some of those things can be expressed in ways that are material. Okay, you'll see some examples of that in just a second. But for the most part, what they're really doing is representing some type of abstraction. Okay, so let's come up with some examples when we talk about symbolic culture. And again, I'm going to make a short list here. We'll definitely come back to a lot of these issues in future parts of the lecture. But when we think about symbolic culture, many things that come to mind are things like values, language. We can definitely say that things like gestures, body movement, and it can also fall under the idea of symbolic or non-material culture, and of course ideas about things that we believe in, or beliefs. Okay? So when we look at this list, we look at values, concepts of things we find appealing or desirable, languages, specific ways in which we communicate, gestures, as we said, movements of body, there's lots of different ways, and beliefs, things we believe in. We can clearly see that these all have to do with thinking and behavior. These are abstractions, things which have no material substance to them. In other words, we can't touch them. When we talk about material culture, we're for the most part referring to objects. Okay? Things that have a substance. In other words, things we can touch. So when we talk about these things, and these are a lot more of the identifiable things that we think about when we think about culture, we think about clothing or clothings. We think about things like jewelry. We think about transportation. We think about architecture. Different types of money, weapons, personal belongings. These are all things that we consider to be examples of material culture. In other words, these are objects, they are things we can touch. Okay? So, knowing that both symbolic and material culture are things that we learn throughout society. Again, we are not born with any of these things, whether or not they're symbolic or material. These are not things that a human baby has instinctively. Okay? Whether or not it's knowledge of material culture or the gaining of symbolic culture, these are things that we gain in the future module. We'll talk about a process called socialization in which we gain these things. But for right now, we'll leave it at the fact that we know that culture is learned, it is not natural behavior. All right? So what happens when we come into contact with cultures other than our own? Cultures that either have different material culture or think and behave in ways different than we are. We call those ideas culture shock. It's probably a term you've heard a number of times, maybe even used yourself. So when we're exposed to cultures other than our own, we experience culture shock. Okay? I often use the example of, you can think about culture shock as occurring in various degrees. We can talk about mild culture shock, we can talk about very extreme culture shock. So for instance, I was to take you as an example, as an individual, or take a class full of people and picked us up and magically transported us to another culture, and let's say it took us all to England, took us all to London, and plopped you down in the middle of Trafalgar Square and said, go get lunch. Would you find that to be a difficult thing to do? My guess is probably not. Okay, and why? We definitely recognize that there'd be some differences between American culture and British culture, but for the most part, we're going to look at a lot of similarities. Very much the language is very similar. You'd probably find that the city is laid out in a very similar way. You'd recognize a lot of the signs. Maybe some of the signs or the words used would be different. If you weren't really acquainted with it, you might see an advertisement for, let's say, fish and chips, and not realize that you were going to get fish and French fries, or bangers and mash, and not realize what you were going to get until you sat down and were served sausage, and you say, okay, why do they call it bangers? But my guess is you would probably find that the exposure to that separate culture would not be that different, and you would experience what we might call mild culture shock. If I were to pick you up and place you in the middle of downtown Tokyo and say, go get lunch, again, if you're not familiar with Japanese culture, you would probably find that much more challenging. Okay? First of all, the language is very different. You might not understand the customs having to do with ordering food in certain areas. You wouldn't, certainly they'd be serving you with different types of utensils. So that culture shock would be much greater. So when we experience cultures different than our own, especially cultures which have very different types of symbolic and material culture, we're going to experience something called culture shock. And there are two ways that we sometimes talk about our reaction to those things. When we talk about comparing cultures, and one is called ethnocentrism, and the other is called cultural relativism. And you can kind of look at these as an either or, kind of a versus type of thing. One can either be ethnocentric or one can attempt to be culturally relative, and these are two different types of experiences when we talk about dealing with cultures other than our own. Okay? To be ethnocentric basically means to believe that your culture, the culture that you've basically been raised in or are most familiar with, is, for the most part, kind of the center of the universe, as it were, that you judge other cultures based on your own culturization or your own culture's experiences. We often talk about very negative aspects of this, but there are certainly some positive as well. When we talk about some of the positive effects of ethnocentrism, we talk sometimes about the idea of building cultural identity or group unity. We certainly, as individuals, tend to gravitate toward people with our own culture, especially sometimes in situations where we're experiencing culture shock. So once again, if I placed you in downtown Tokyo and told you to get lunch, where would I find the majority of people, especially Americans, within a half hour? I'd probably find you at a McDonald's, okay? We would gravitate toward a symbol, the golden arches, that we recognize, and we would gravitate toward food that we're comfortable with, okay? So certainly adventurous people might say, I'm not going to eat at McDonald's, I want to try something different. But if you're experiencing a large amount of culture shock, you might very well just see a McDonald's and say, I know what I can get there, so I'm going to go do it. We certainly, when we're experiencing culture shock, tend to gravitate toward people who are speaking the same language as we are. So if you were wandering around downtown Tokyo, desperately trying to find something to eat, and you heard somebody speaking English, you would probably be very grateful and walk up to that person and attempt to get that person to help you, or at least just kind of commiserate with that person about the difficulties you're having. These are all reactions we have which would be considered ethnocentric. Again, not a value judgment placed on this. It's neither good nor bad. It is a phenomenon. Another positive aspect of ethnocentrism is the fact that we talked about the idea that cultures are handed down, okay, through generations. If you are basically ingratiated into, satisfied with, feel comfortable in your own culture, then that's the culture you're going to hand down when it comes time for you to proliferate or have children of your own. So the very fact that cultures survive by being handed down is a basis based on the idea that people feel comfortable with their own cultures. So in other words, why growing up in America would we probably, again, there's different experiences, certainly among different ethnic groups within the country, but for the most part, most of us who speak English, when we have children, we teach our children to speak English. We teach our children to wear the same types of clothing we have. We raise them in let's say, a specific religious belief, okay, the one that we feel comfortable with. Are those bad things? No, of course not. And again, sociology strives to be very much value-free. We're trying to examine things from a non-biased way. So when we look at the ideas of group loyalty as well as cultural proliferation, we realize that ethnocentrism has some very positive aspects to it. Are there negative aspects to it? Of course there are. We talk about the idea, if you only look at other societies or other cultures in comparison to your own, this can lead to absolutely intolerance or discrimination against other cultures, basically deciding that your culture is superior in some ways or that other cultures are inferior. And of course, if you act on those beliefs, that is called discrimination. So we can definitely say that there are positive and negative aspects to ethnocentrism. And then the flip side of the coin is cultural relativism, okay? The idea of understanding another culture on its own terms. Okay? So again, you might be that person who says, if I was in Tokyo, I would absolutely want to eat Japanese food. I would want to go to a Japanese tea house or a noodle house and try to experience the culture for itself. That would be an attempt at being culturally relative. Sometimes I challenge people to say, okay, is it possible to be 100% culturally relative with total effectiveness? Typically the answer is no. Why is that? Well, because, again, as we'll talk about in Module 3, we have been socialized into a specific culture. And in a sense, that's kind of the blueprint, or you might say the foundation on which our entire identity is determined. So as much as we would look at another culture and say, I would like to try that, I would like to be that, I would like to experience that, in some ways we're always going to come back to our own culture as a quote-unquote kind of ground zero or a baseline by which we're going to judge our experiences in dealing with other cultures. Okay? So we can never quite get away from the way that we have been socialized, or we can never get away from our own culture, even when we're attempting to be completely culturally relative. So I will sometimes then challenge classes to say, okay, out of the two of these, the ethnocentrism versus cultural relativism, which do you as a class, in a class of introduction to sociology students, think is quote unquote better? And who agrees with trying to be culturally relative as opposed to being ethnocentric? And I'll usually, ask for a show of hands or just people to speak out. And even having said everything that I just said, I'll usually find that most students feel that being culturally relative is in some ways preferential or better than being ethnocentric. And because we tend to think of the ideas of tolerance as being, and of course it's very important, but being in some ways, like I said, better than regarding your own culture positively. So I'll then often say, okay, what do you think about this? In some areas of the world, in the lives of adolescent girls, there is sometimes a cultural belief or a cultural behavior which results in girls who are approaching the time of their first menses, their first period, to be taken from the villages or the towns in which they live to an area outside the village, usually by their own mothers, grandmothers, elder women of the culture, and usually taken to a place outside of where they live, in which they are, in a lot of cases, in a manner kind of secrecy, taken to a specific place, in no way approaching what we would normally consider in today's society hospital conditions or sterile conditions, oftentimes forcibly held down by sometimes their own mothers, grandmothers, other female relatives, and have their clitorises, again, the part of the female anatomy which is analogous to the male penis, which provides sexual pleasure during intercourse, forcibly removed, and sometimes, again, done with instruments that are nowhere considered surgical or conditions that are sterile. And this is done as a means of trying to control female sexual pleasure. Okay, that is a cultural belief. The underlying belief in a lot of cultures is that this will prevent adolescent females from engaging in premarital or extramarital sexual activity, which makes them more valuable to their husbands or their families because they will be virgins at the time of their arranged marriages. So having said that, then I usually ask the students, what do you think about that practice? And of course, most of us would say that practice is not good. That's barbaric. That is against human rights. That violates an individual's right to happiness, to not being mutilated, those kind of things. And then my challenge is, are you not being rather ethnocentric when you say that? You are now judging another culture based on your attitudes and beliefs about human quality of life, and you're not being very culturally relative. Okay? So in saying that, I'm not trying to challenge people's attempts to be culturally relative. I'm just illustrating my point that it's very difficult for us to be 100% culturally relative because of this idea that we always have a baseline of our own values and beliefs by which we will judge other cultures. Okay? The last thing I wanted to say, just based on this, is the idea then of, again, ethnocentrism versus cultural relativism. Very difficult and sometimes very complex matters to figure out. There was an attempt at one time by an anthropologist by the name of Roger Edgerton to determine a scale that he said we could judge quality of life issues. So in other words, we could take a whole bunch of different behaviors, put them on a scale, give them a numerical value, let's say from a value of 0 to 100, and try to establish this idea of, okay, if we want to look at behaviors around the world, such as educating children, child abuse, family composition, and all these other activities, and put them on this scale, if we judge those behaviors based on whether or not they enhance or diminish quality of life, we can actually come to a scale that we as human beings globally can agree on. Of course, the big problem is when we look at those types of scales, people's cultures still inherently interfere with some of those ideas. So let's say, for instance, in the United States, we could say that child abuse is wrong, and that we have laws to do that. That of course doesn't mean that no child abuse exists in our society. So we still have to look at, okay, despite the fact that we say that we have these ideals and values, do we always live up to them? The second point being that different cultures will still have different ideas about what constitutes quality of life. In other societies, things that we take for granted in the United States all the time are considered barbaric. We could actually make the point that we can look at other cultures and say things like, let's say, female circumcision is a practice which we would not condone in the United States, but we do routinely practice male circumcision. And in other societies, that is considered a barbaric practice, where in our society is considered relatively normal. So we can clearly see that this issue of ethnocentrism versus cultural relativism can often be complex.